Okay, well, thank you for having me again. I'm happy to participate, and I'm going to explain about the full spectrum macrobiotic approach. I call it the 21st century full spectrum macrobiotic approach. And this is an approach basically that I discovered over many years to make some improvements in macrobiotic practices based on lessons that I learned over 40 plus years as a macrobiotic educator with 40,000 plus clients and students in my private practice and 27 years of faculty of the US-based Cushing Institute. And I was the only teacher on the faculty of the US Cushing Institute who taught and counseled consistently over 27 years. So I had a lot of inside information and was able to see what worked best for both teachers and students. And after 40 plus years of these using non-invasive diagnosis methods, I also found for a new system of diagnosis that I call IDX diagnosis I'm going to explain about also as part of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to give a little background for this to explain how I came about this. Many, many years ago, I think it was sometime in the early 90s, one of my teachers got sick with cancer, one of my macrobiotic teachers, and I started then to investigate why that happened because they seemed to be eating the best diet, and I wondered about that. So I started looking at a lot of different things that I hadn't looked at before, such as traditional Chinese medicine and Asian medicines and Ayurveda, and I realized that these were the basis. These were macrobiotic teachings in the biggest sense, because macrobiotic, the word that I understand macrobiotic from Hippocrates means longevity, and Ayurveda means the science of long life, while in Chinese medicine, the basis was something called Yang Shen Dao, which means the Tao or the big way of long life. So I started to study lots of different approaches to answer that question, and as I did, other teachers, longtime macrobiotic teachers, were diagnosed with cancer, which made me wonder why that was happening, because they were eating this diet that was supposed to be the cancer prevention diet. So I investigated the work of Weston Price. Weston Price was a dentist who went around the world, and he studied cultures in the 30s. And his question was, would people have better dental health than he saw in his Cleveland clinic? Because he saw a lot of poor dental health back then in the 1930s. And he found, traveling around the world like Africa, Switzerland, Scotland, South America, and other places, and Alaska, that people had excellent dental health, but they also tended to be, if not completely free, mostly free of modern diseases like cancer and heart disease that other people who were following modern diets around them had. I also looked at longevity cultures and studied them to see what they were doing. And it brought up more questions about what I was learning and teaching people for many years. And some of those questions, I was wondering why some people did well eating a more or less vegan standard macrobiotic diet. I also wondered, was the foods that were criticized as being bad all bad, since traditional cultures ate them, such as Weston Price studied. So people were eating natural meats and dairy and were healthy and free of disease. So were they all bad, or was there something else going on? Was there any therapeutic benefit of them? Also, I looked at things like, did it matter? Some of the things we were learning, or I was teaching, how you stirred the soup in one direction or another. Was that really that important? And many other questions, including, can supplements be helpful? And also, I started to see people were being diagnosed with severe deficiencies, like nutritional deficiencies, and I wondered why, if the diet was supposed to be very well balanced, and many, many other things. As I did that over the years, I kept looking at these things. I started to think that things needed to be changed. And then more teachers were getting sick of cancer, long-term teachers who were 20, 30 years doing this and passing away at a fairly young age, not at older ages. And then also even a few teachers died of heart disease at a fairly young age. And so it made me realize that and think that things had to change. And so part of the reasoning behind making these changes was that I came up with a full spectrum, what I call a full spectrum macrobiotic approach. I explain this more in detail on my website, macrobiotic.com, for people who want to learn more. There's also a lot of free information, articles I wrote on the website. There's about 60, maybe close to 80 videos on YouTube you could look at. Some are small, some are long classes, where I explain about these discoveries, what I call a full spectrum macrobiotic approach. And before I get into some of the specifics of it, I just want to talk about some of the philosophy behind it, because everything really leads with a philosophy. So as a part of my understanding, I was looking at macrobiotics as a way of longevity and a philosophy of life and living, which includes diet, but not a rigid diet. It's more of a philosophy applied to diet, applying the philosophy of balance in our daily lives, including diet. And rather than a regimen where there are do's and don'ts, where people, in the 20th century, the macrobiotic approach has been focusing a lot on diet of do's and don'ts. And I came to expressing this as something like a small m macrobiotics, which is a set of rules and regulations handed down by authorities who knows best for us, versus big M macrobiotics, which is a practice of the philosophy of balance based on doing things that we understand well, a bigger understanding of food and life, a larger understanding, so we understand the range of things, and also applying it to our lives and through our own experience. So this is, instead of being guidelines, saying things like everybody should do things a certain way, there's a limited authority, like coming from an authority, everything should be done a certain way because this is the way it is. I think there should be a limited authority of people who have experience, who can help people and guide people, limited so that the person can start to experience what is good for them and to study so they understand why. And the why is really important because so many people are telling us what to do. We need to know, make sense of which ones should we follow, which of the things that everybody's telling us what to do should we follow. So I broke this down into a few areas, and then I'll elaborate a little bit more on this, on things that I felt needed to be updated and improved over the years. And I've been using this in counseling and consultations and over the last decade or more as I made these changes. So in food, I felt there was a need to understand nutrients differently. And I came up with a different way of understanding food and energetics of food based on traditional Eastern medicine, which was energetic in nature, in that all foods had a benefit, animal and vegetable foods. If we leave out one class of foods, then we're missing the traditional energetics. Places like Asia, Chinese medicine, they valued all foods. They just had a balance of certain foods, and they understood the energetic nature of foods. So I came up with an energetic understanding of food and the body applied to health that was based on the principles of balance, yin and yang. But instead of yin being something like expansive, I saw yin as being releasing and activating the body, and yang as gathering and building. So from this perspective, then something like grains are a releasing energy food, although they're moderately releasing energy in our food in a sense. And then natural animal food has a gathering effect of various kinds, fish being the lightest and something like red meat being the strongest. And traditional cultures understood and used this understanding to realize that people needed certain foods. Some people needed the building effect of a natural red meat, while other people needed less of that, or needed fish, or needed to eat a lighter diet. So, but based on the energetic of food, I also interpreted, looked at the nutritional content of food that I felt needed to be changed in common macrobiotic eating practice in the 20th century, and that included things like fats. So that people's diets, people on very low fat diets, including, I saw this with many people, had started to have many health issues because fat is a very important nutrient. Without fat, you don't absorb certain other nutrients. And the nutrient perspective, as I learned from my teachers and was teaching, was seen as not being that important, but the energetic perspective of health and diet has a certain value, which is kind of an overview. And then the nutritional perspective has a more material understanding, which we can also use, and I found it useful. So in fats are very important for body structures, but the problem today with fats is not that people are eating too much saturated fat. People are actually eating less saturated fat. But what they're doing is eating a lot of these polyunsaturated fats, particularly poor quality. And these are the ones that damage the body and are cancer causing and lead to heart disease. And so the fats that I found very beneficial is that people need more monounsaturated and saturated fats, and low fat diets create a lot of deficiencies of things like calcium and B vitamins. And I saw evidence to that, and science made sense to me. And I saw evidence around me that people were having problems with B vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins like A and D because their diet was too low fat. So people need what I discovered is people need a more moderately fat-rich diet with monounsaturated fats. If people are open to eating natural animal food, then that would be things like butter or other natural fats from animal foods and coconut oil. And this also, as I mentioned this, I should mention that the macrobiotic teachings of the 20th century were primarily vegan-oriented with a little fish. And traditional cultures around the world were quite healthy, adding in animal fats as well as animal proteins in moderate portions. And a lot of the evidence that shows that those are harmful has some problems with it around the world, because it doesn't separate the fact that around the world people are eating meat, but they're eating highly processed foods and they're eating a lot of sugar and chemicals in their diet. They're eating a really terrible diet. The people who eat the most meat around the world also eat the most sugar. They eat the most processed foods. They eat the most chemicals in their foods. They eat the less vegetables. They usually smoke more and they drink more. So there's a lot of other things going on that's causing their health problems. When you look at Weston Price's teachings, where people were eating natural meats but not smoking, not drinking, not eating processed foods, they had a really different effect. And people who eat diets of that moderately. So fats are very important. I think that we need, at least tablespoons of fats a day. Coconut oil as a saturated fat. Saturated fats also have been unfairly demonized, and there's a lot of, when I started to look at and question things, I looked at the information that said saturated fats were bad, and then compared it to the information that people were saying saturated fats were good, and found that basically the truth is someplace in the middle. We should basically we can eat some saturated fats as long as we don't eat a cup a day of them and get a benefit from them. Too much of any kind of food generally causes some problems. So adding more fats, and what I found is that people, when eating more fats, were more satisfied. They digested their food better. They had better bones, teeth health, skin health, hair health, better digestion, a lot of improvements. Also, I found one change that was important is that people needed more protein. And the reason, I have an article where I explain about this called How to Be Safe on a Vegan Diet on my website. And what happens is that people on vegan diets still are getting very low amounts of protein because most people need at least 40 to 60 grams of protein, and grains and beans are very low in protein. So if you using tofu or tempeh as a daily protein source has problems because of certain anti-nutrients that are in tofu or tempeh, so it can't really be used. For some people, it can't even be used weekly because they have problems with the phytoestrogens, the phytic acid in there that can deplete the body. So protein, lack of concentrated protein from animal food along with eating enough food would give people adequate protein. So if someone's eating enough food, natural animal protein doesn't need to be eaten that much. But the natural animal protein has a more concentrated protein, so you don't have to eat as much. And the vegetable proteins are not completely complete proteins. And what I discovered when people start to eat some natural animal protein regularly, that they did much better. Protein is important from a nutritional perspective for things like your bones, for your digestion, for your brain. One of the things I started to realize when I was at the Cush Institute for many years, and I was teaching programs there at a teacher training program, is that when people began the first month of their training, they would be very nice and friendly. Second month, they'd be less friendly. And the third month, they would be very unfriendly with many people. The funny thing is the people who were the most friendly were going out and eating other places, they're so-called binging. And it was something that repeated over the years, over and over again. And one of the things I think, I also realized that people who were working there regularly, they didn't have the best moods. They had all kinds of mood issues, and some people were seeking psychological reasons for this. But then I came across information that a certain amount of proteins are needed for brain chemicals to function. And it's not the only thing that makes your brain function. You have to have good ethics and philosophy and other things that will make your behavior good. But the brain chemicals need to be fostered by eating certain amounts of protein, and you need a balance of the brain chemicals. And I started to realize that what was happening was people were protein deficient. And when we talk about my next aspect of this IDX diagnosis, then I see that basically there's a way of diagnosing protein deficiencies that I discovered. And many people, after a period of time of eating close to vegan or vegan macrobiotic eating, would show protein deficiencies if they weren't taking any kind of protein sources. There's ways to make balance for this to some extent for people who want to be vegan or vegetarian, and I'll talk about that too. So also I noticed that the nutritional content of food I started to look at and realized, because that animal food and vegetable foods were balancing each other. In the bigger perspective, we need food for energy more than anything else. That would be like mostly starches, including starches such as whole grains and vegetables and beans, because we get energy from them. And we need small amounts of sugar for quick energy. So this is another energetic aspect of food that I've looked at. And then we need foods for building, which is protein. And the amount of protein in grains and beans is about 10 to 15%. So unless you eat a huge amount of food, it's really hard to get the protein you need. So then proteins are building foods, energetically building foods like natural animal foods. So in varying degrees, depending on the person, people need these, what I discovered regularly. Now, if a person wants to be vegetarian, then one of the things that I discovered is that a lot of the cultures around the world valued eggs, and it was even considered a strengthening, building foods in Asia. They call these Jing foods to build internal energy. And that a lot of the information that I was teaching over the years, promoting more vegan eating, was not true about eggs. The cholesterol in eggs doesn't cause heart disease, I discovered. When you look closely, the saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease. The only thing about eggs that for some people, the moderation of them is it's a rich food, so it's a digestive issue more than anything for people. And so if someone wants to be vegetarian, I found the same, they could incorporate eggs along with grains, beans, and vegetables and get more complete nutrition, the protein, and some nutrients that are only in animal food. And then also the same thing with dairy products. When you look at Weston Price's studies and research, he found people eating dairy products that were from grass-fed animals were cancer-free. They had no reproductive problems. They had no ovarian problems. They had no heart disease. So there's something, my conclusion that it's something about the modern dairy foods that is causing problems, just like something about the modern meat and the overeating of it that is the issue in causing health issues in America, along with a lot of bad quality processed foods. So for vegans who want to balance the proteins and fats, I think there has to be a certain balance in diet. I talk about this on how to be safe on a vegan diet on my website. And I also talk about the need for supplements, because they're in animal food. There's nutrients that are only in animal food, not in vegetable foods, or at least highly absorbable, including B12, B6, B vitamins, zinc, calcium, vitamin A and D, and some specific amino acids that some people need, like tyrosine and carnitine. And the traditional view of animal food, that it was this building food, the definition of yin and yang in China was different than modern definition of yin and yang in the 20th century macrobiotics. So their version of yang was food that gives energy, and their definition of yin was food that builds substance. So meat was considered both a yin and yang builder. So for people with deficiencies, it would be recommended in moderate amounts to use some natural red meat as the most concentrated. So not only meat, but animal foods have these nutrients too in them. The other major change that I found in food was salt. It was an issue, and I came to understand why there was such a fear of salt as making people very contractive, to use the 20th century macrobiotic term, or yang, or contractive. And the reason for that is because when the diet is I discovered when the diet is very low in fat, then people become super sensitive to salt, fat and salt. And it turns out there's a science behind it, even though we know that by taste, that salt tastes good with fat. And there's a yin and yang of it. We could say fat is full of energy and releasing, and salt is heavy and dense. So there's a balancing factor. But the science of it, that salt, fat helps you absorb the salts in your system. Without salt, without fat, you may not absorb as well. So, so I understood in a very low fat diet, the salt was de-emphasized. But the problem is that salt was valued around the world. And one of the reasons through my research I found that it was valued is that salt is very important for digestion. It stimulates the production of stomach acids through the chloride, sodium chloride. And the chloride aspect of this stimulates the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And the hydrochloric acid, when that's stimulated, it helps your digestive system produce digestive enzymes. So that having a certain amount of adequate, good quality salt in your diet helps you get more from all your food. It has other benefits in the body, but that's one of the main things. The other thing about food I discovered is that people needed a variety of, more variety of vegetables, grains, starches, other starches that were traditionally valued, like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and foods in general. And then also, one of the things I thought was a very big problem with food was also calorie restriction, because people would fill up on fiber or not eat enough food. And there's some evidence that people need much more calories, otherwise the body goes into the stress mode. And one of the benefits of things like fasting, at least temporary benefits that people perceive of fasting and new theories like intermittent fasting, and also eating a diet that is very low in calories, and lower in nutrients, like vegan diets, is that you go into a stress mode and you start to produce a lot of brain chemicals. They're called catabolic chemicals. And these brain chemicals make you high. And then it also stimulates your adrenal glands. And then what happens that if you keep doing that, after a while, that honeymoon, I call it the catabolic honeymoon, stops. Usually takes about a year. Any extreme diet does that. Missing like low carb diets, raw foods diets, anything that's missing nutrients puts you into this catabolic state. And after about a year, the catabolic honeymoon is over. So what happened, what I noticed in macrobiotic practices, what would happen in the 20th century, in my years at the Kozinski Institute, people started taking other things to stimulate their adrenals. So common things was a lot of the teachers would start smoking. I'm a former smoker. I was one of them who began and stopped. It's been 20 years now. And then also people would start craving coffee as stimulants. And the other thing is interesting, we always had crises, and that would also get your adrenal glands going and stimulate. So every once in a while there'd be a crisis. And so people would use these to stimulate their adrenals, so to keep the honeymoon going. So these are some of the changes that I found that I needed to make and made in the full spectrum macrobiotic approach. You can learn more about this at my website. The second aspect of changes that I've made, which I call full spectrum macrobiotic approach, is in something I call IDX diagnosis. And IDX diagnosis is something where I started to realize and identify had people had nutritional deficiencies, because I started to value and something that wasn't valued so much except for promoting veganism in 20th century macrobiotics was the study of nutrition. And what I started to do is study nutrition from people who were pro-vegan and anti-vegan, and as most things, I found the truth was someplace in the middle. That for health, we need to be, in a sense, mostly vegan, but with natural animal foods. Most people, if they were open to it, would do well with it every day. Because I started to study nutritional deficiencies, and I saw all these nutritional deficiencies, signs of nutritional deficiencies. For instance, people would have like when I do acupressure massage and practices, and when I would massage people's back who were long-term, more or less vegan or vegan macrobiotics, all the muscles near the spine would be collapsed. There'd be no muscles there going down the spine, and that was a sign I saw. One of the signs of a protein deficiency. Another sign would be where the cheeks were really sunken in and thin. This is another sign of protein deficiency, but this could also be a sign of a calorie deficiency, because if you don't eat enough calories, then you don't get enough protein also, and you don't absorb protein as well. In a sense, the more calories you eat, the less protein, concentrate protein you may need, but you still need it. So I interpret this as part of my IDX diagnosis. I also incorporated and start to realize the value of nutritional supplements, particularly for people who are sick. And I found in both personal experience and counseling people that they're not extreme. And I think they're absolutely necessary for people who want to be on vegan diets, because I saw severe nutrition deficiencies that people were hospitalized of B12, protein, other mineral deficiencies. Some who are hospitalized with those kinds of things among long-term vegan, near-vegan macrobiotic eaters. I also started to study, as part of the diagnosis, the use of medicinal and tonic herbs based on Chinese medical diagnosis. My IDX diagnosis I developed because after many years of studying Japanese Oriental medical diagnosis from my teachers, I started to look at Chinese and Ayurvedic diagnosis. And I realized that the Chinese and Ayurvedic diagnosis had something that was alluded to by my teachers, but they went into it more. And what they alluded to is that the importance of understanding the constitution, your genetics. And so I studied that very well to see how to see this very carefully, your strengths and weaknesses, so I could evaluate with people and teach students about this who wanted to be teachers. And then also they had a different understanding of condition, where rather than looking at, say, one part of the face, as we learned in the 20th century macrobiotic diagnosis, and say a person has a heart problem because of a swollen nose, they actually traditionally looked at the whole body, face, hands, feet, talking, and tried to see what kind of overall condition were that. Was it a condition of excess? Was it a condition of deficiency? And based on this, then I use this as a guide to give recommendations. For instance, there was a popular drink that some people will remember, maybe still use, called the carrot and daikon drink, daikon radish and carrots. And this was being recommended to everybody across the board, but I realized that a lot of people who it was being recommended to had a condition of deficiency. And this drink was to cleanse excess from the body, particularly excess fats and congestion from overeating animal food and poor quality fats. But it was being recommended without understanding that this condition, this person would have to have a true excess condition. And most of the people weren't being recommended with that. And so then it would make them weaker. In some one case, very well-known teacher recommended to this person who had been eating a vegan macrobiotic diet for years, and they were as skinny, very, very skinny, and it was really depleting to them. Their condition got worse and worse and worse. So I started to refine my remedies and understanding of what people need and why some people may need, if they were open to it, natural animal foods, because they had a quite deficient condition. I saw also many people, unless they had a very strong and hardy constitution, didn't do well on vegan macrobiotic diets because traditionally they would know this in Asian cultures that they would need some natural animal foods, especially meat. And in fact, one well-known teacher I studied with for years recommended meat to someone years ago. But then as vegan diets got more popular and became more commercially viable, as you might say, the commercial industry is now really promoting vegan diets because of all these health products related to veganism. So this is basically, then that teacher started to also go in that direction, as well as many other teachers started to do that too. I'm not saying it's for only commercial reasons, but this is one of the reasons why they've become popular. My IDX diagnosis also is something that combines, it takes basically the traditional Eastern diagnosis of looking at the face, the hands, the feet, the body, the way a person talks, their posture, and combines it with progressive modern biology so that, for instance, an energy deficiency, which is recognized traditionally in Eastern medicine, I see as a weak metabolism or a low metabolism. And then you have to decide how to make that metabolism stronger, usually by strengthening digestion, nutrition, breathing. To learn more about this, I have some articles on my website. I have some also YouTube videos. And this is the basis of my IDX diagnosis, is the basis of my health coach training program. It's called Diagnosis Plus Health Coach Training. That's a 20-class program that people can learn and study. Then the third aspect of my full spectrum macrobiotics that I'll just talk about, so I don't go too far over. I know I'm the last person, so I guess that's okay. But a little bit more I'll talk about this is what I discovered that was a very great insight in the last years was the role of stress in creating disease. And in fact, I came to the conclusion that it's not diet that creates illness. It's not diet that creates cancer, heart disease, osteoporosis. Although diet plays its part, it's stress. And part of this was based on the work of the stress pioneer, Hans Selye. So Hans Selye was a doctor who coined the term stress in its relation to health and illness. And before that, stress was only basically applied to buildings and machines and in industry. And then he realized that it had effect on the body. And so there's a certain amount of stress that our body can handle. And when it can't handle, it exhausts the internal energy, which basically he said that every person had. And this is similar to what they said in Asian medicine, that inside we have an internal energy. In India, they call it ojas, and in China, they call it jing. And he basically Just called it an energy that we're born with, adaptive energy. That's what Selye talked about. So there are nutritional causes of stress. And one of the reasons when I started to learn about stress that I realized that people had to make changes in their diet because any nutrient that is missing, and I found that many people, if they're open to it, do need to eat some natural animal food daily, as traditional people did. And if that nutrition from the animal food was either not eaten or not made up from with supplements, then this would put a stress on the body. If a person wasn't eating enough food, this would put a stress on the body and put the body into a stress reaction. And the stress reaction, as Selye, creates all kinds of mental, physical, and emotional problems. And eventually, the whole body starts to shut down if it's under stress, and it creates organ imbalances. There's some evidence that diabetes is mainly caused by stress response because the cortisol, which is a stress hormone, interferes with the body's ability to produce insulin and utilize insulin. Also, it's related to heart disease. There's evidence it's related to cancer. So long-time stress from nutritional deficiency. So for instance, if someone cuts out carbs too long, that creates a stress on the body. Someone cuts out nutrients that are only in animal protein, that puts a stress on the body. If someone basically eats a lot of modern foods, like a lot of sugar, that puts a stress on the body. If people eat a lot of factory farm junk meat, what I call factory farm junk meat, then that puts a stress on the body. And if someone basically is, anything that's missing in the diet is basically causing stress. In lifestyle, anything that is basically, one of the teachings of longevity is put in a funny way. If you want to live long, don't do stupid things. So like smoking, drinking a lot of alcohol, taking drugs, jumping out of airplanes, jumping off mountains, doing sports that are dangerous. These are all things that, don't help for your longevity. They could be dangerous for you. So in our lifestyle, creating a lifestyle that is moderate so that you don't use up too much energy, but you utilize just enough energy to enrich and enhance your life, because that's the purpose of life, is to have an experience. So on a lifestyle and environmental causes of stress, like we're exposed to toxins, burning the candle at both ends is another lifestyle, working too much, not enough rest, all kinds of lifestyle causes. And then I discovered there were stress postures. This was from a couple of different health pioneers that I returned onto. Actually, three pioneers actually came from. One is Ida Rolf. The other one was Thomas Hanna, and several other pioneers, but those were the two major ones rather than three. And Thomas Hanna came up with this brilliant idea that when the body's under stress, it starts to create certain postures in the body. Main one being that the posture starts to pull forward. But when you're under good stress, like putting out energy, your posture, all your back muscles tighten up, and your leg becomes straight. But after a while, he calls this the red light reflex, the green light reflex, that is. After a while, your body says stop, it starts to go forward. So not only getting rid of one of the discoveries that I incorporated in full spectrum macrobiotic approach is that not only does you have to try to get rid of the causes of the stress, you have to correct the stresses in the body. And there is particular types of exercises that are working that do this. Basically, all exercise, moderate exercise does it, but the basic exercise is called pandiculation. Stretching doesn't do it, but pandiculation does. That's what cats and dogs do. They tighten a body, they tighten a part of the body and then they basically they lengthen it. And this is the basis of exercises like Qigong and something called somatics by Thomas Hanna. So these are, some of the practices. This is some of the basic practices of the full spectrum macrobiotic approach that I utilize. And I know there are a lot of questions about this, and some of the questions I've looked at a lot of the issues, and they might come up too, about some of the things I'm recommending. So maybe, I know we went over a little bit. I don't know if we have 10 minutes for questions or if we could do 5 minutes. It's up to you.
Let's see what we've got. Does anyone have a question here?
I do. Did I need to raise my hand?
No, go ahead.
Oh, great, thanks. I just wanted to find out, well, first of all, I wanted to find out if we can rehear this. I'd like to rehear this talk. And then the other thing is, can you put your information in the, you said that you had a website we can go to. Can you put that in the chat? Thanks.
So about rehearing it, everything is being recorded as we speak. So if you are on my mailing list, you'll know about it.
And it said it's for sale. Macrobiotic.com is for sale. Am I?
No.
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 John, I wonder if you have a few words to say on the condition of osteoporosis and the bones and what that means.
Sure. Well, osteoporosis, what I discovered, there's two ways that I actually look at it, like everything, like yin and yang. But one way is the energetic perspective is osteoporosis is a whole body disease. And it's related to an exhaustion of the internal energy. And this is based on Oriental medicine's idea that the bones are related to the internal energy they call Jing, or kidney energy. And so generally the approach, from that view, the approach to helping a person with osteoporosis is to build the body on a deep level. Interesting enough, some of the foods that are Jing builders that would be good for this kidney energy or the bones are usually foods that nutritionally are also good for the bones too. So that's, the energetic perspective is to rebuild the internal energy. And so part of that is getting the body out of the stress mode, identifying anything that is causing stress, whether it be missing nutrients or lifestyle, that would help the bones. Also, the traditional view is also weight-bearing exercise, but not weightlifting, or like Tai Chi and Qigong would build bone by putting pressure on the bone in a healthy way. And I teach some exercises that are particularly good for bone density. And then the nutritional perspective is the bones need, the bones are basically 40% protein and 60% minerals. So the protein makes them flexible. So often if the protein is not enough in one's diet, then basically the bones will become weak. So in order to build bone, often the person will need, if they're open to it, some natural animal protein, or if a person is not open to natural animal protein, then at least even kind of a vegetable protein, even as a powder, because they need extra protein to build bones. So that would be important. If a person was would be open to eating natural animal protein, they would need it every day to build the bone, but that means they have to have also adequate calories, so they absorb the protein, and adequate carbohydrate from grains, basically, and other foods to do that. Also, vitamin D and vitamin K2. This is actually, K2 is, from a nutritional perspective, the K2 has been found to be very important. There's a balance between these three nutrients, vitamin D, K2, and vitamin A, and they are bone building. Calcium is an issue, but it's not as important as these. So as we get older, it's been found that we don't absorb vitamin D as much from the sun. We don't produce D, not absorb it, but we don't produce it from the sun. So then many people benefit from taking a vitamin D supplement, but if you take a vitamin D supplement alone, without K, the calcium can get into the wrong parts of the body. That's what they've discovered with vitamin K2. So usually people take a vitamin D and K2 supplement, and then vitamin A is only available for people as they get older from animal sources, because the carotenes don't convert very easily. So you could either take vitamin A from a supplement, usually need about, for say, if someone was taking 5,000 IU of D, which is a good amount to build your D up. And you would take about 20,000 of A. Interesting enough, with the coronavirus, all the vitamin A is getting sold out because people know it's good for the immunity. It's very hard to find online, but it can be. Vitamin A rich foods would be things like sardines, natural liver. Those would be the most concentrated form of that. If someone was open to eating a natural liver, which was considered also a Jing building food traditionally, ironically, and it's good for the bones, you only need it once or twice a week to get plenty of A. Sardines would be the same. You would need it a few times a week to get A. And if you eat the whole sardine, the benefit of that is you're also getting the calcium in the bone. So, the other thing is that a calcium source is important. And usually you can't get enough calcium from greens. It's not enough. So either someone would need to eat some whole dairy products a little bit daily, like things like our fermented ones, like raw cheese or whole milk yogurt, or take a calcium supplement. Some of them have D and K too. So there's some companies that are very good quality with that. Jarrow is one of them. There's a product called Bone Builder.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. I just didn't, when you said A, what was the amount, the international units?
If you take it, it's 20 for 5,000. Basically you need about close to 4 or 5 times more A than D. So it's about 25,000 IU of A to 5,000 of D. And in foods, a lot of times, like in sardines, they'll have a lot of that balance. But usually, because people don't produce D as they get older, it's okay to take D every day, even if you're taking the sardines and getting some D. Someone's eating sardines.
Good. I have another question too, if I can, because this is different than what Michio wrote in his book many years ago. Is that it's animal foods that are causing osteoporosis, and you hear a lot of macrobiotic counselors talking about. At least I do, about vitamins being very yin, and so it's very, very hard to balance it. I was wondering if you could talk about those two things.
Well, I think if someone says vitamins are very yin, with all due respects, they haven't studied vitamins. There's yin vitamins and yang vitamins, so, from a yin-yang perspective. So yin vitamins are water soluble. I teach that in my diagnosis and health coach training program. And a lot of people will take that program just for their own learning because it gets into a new approach. It has it's actually building upon the past. It's not getting rid of the past, but building upon the past. So water-soluble vitamins basically are yin because they move quickly. But the ironic thing is that when you're under high amounts of stress, you use up tremendous amounts of water-soluble vitamins like B vitamins and vitamin C. So there's a value of taking them in the modern world because you're using them up. So if you take them, you're not going to be overstimulated by them because you're going to be using them up and they're gone. And they work for the body. The yang vitamins are fat soluble, D, E, A, and K. So they store in the body, but they also get used up too. So for instance, if you have a chronic infection, the A gets used up easily. D gets used up. So they're more like, you don't need quite as much of those because they're strengthened, they're building to the body. That's one aspect. The other thing is I used to teach many years that the animal protein was the main cause of osteoporosis until I started looking at the evidence more closely. And so they do these studies called epidemiological studies. And these are studies where it's based on dietary surveys often. And most people can't remember what they ate last week, but they're asking people what they ate last year. And so it's based on that. When they look closely at those dietary surveys, they found that people are actually wrong. They didn't really eat that because they don't match what was in that town, what was being sold in the town. So they're found to be very inaccurate. And then they're based on things that basically are, they put everything together. So they'll say, oh, the people who eat the most animal food have the most osteoporosis. But it's known that the people, as I mentioned, the people who eat the most animal food around the world drink the most, eat the most sugar, eat the most processed food, eat the least vegetables, smoke the most, and also exercise the least. So any of those things, which of those things is causing that? When I look at the evidence closely for osteoporosis, I haven't seen the link. In fact, is evidence that the people who eat more protein from animal food have less osteoporosis in the world. So I haven't seen that link. Now, it doesn't mean people have to eat huge amounts if the rest of their diet is nutritious and their lifestyle is not so stressful, because cultures around the world didn't have osteoporosis who are living outside all the day, you know, getting a lot of D, you know, having a less stressful lifestyle. Okay, see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, John, David here. What do you think about silica as a precursor for building bones instead of calcium? Well, when I studied macrobiotics, it was the milk was not the real builder for the bones, but possibly the precursor silica, which chickens eat because that's how they make the eggs. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, you know, the other thing is that people who didn't want to eat dairy, there's something called eggshell calcium, which you could actually make from eggs. People are allergic to dairy and they need to get extra calcium. And actually some of the best calcium supplements are actually made from the eggshells. And so the eggs have also high amounts of calcium in eggshells. Eggshells itself is a way of processing that and taking a very small amount daily, you know, a few times a day. But silica, the problem with silica is it could damage the kidneys. So if you take too much of it. And calcium is needed for the bones, but in varying degrees. And what Weston Price is interesting, because when he went around the world studying people, he found that people were basically a lot of people were eating natural dairy calcium. Other people were not eating calcium, but often they made bone broths. So these are the things that people were doing to enhance their calcium, and they still didn't have osteoporosis. The people who were eating dairy, they also had osteoporosis. So there's one other factor, is that if you came from a background where your culture is basically a dairy eating culture, you may have no problems with eating dairy for calcium if it's from good sources like grass-fed cows or goats. If you come from a culture where they didn't eat dairy, it's interesting because the people who came from those cultures, they could actually eat fermented dairy and digest it, but they can't drink straight milk. You know, it just doesn't agree with them. So there's different ways of doing this, but calcium is partly an issue, but it's not the complete picture.
Okay, thank you, John.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question, because I think you said like 1 or 2 tablespoons of oil a day, and that's not hard on the liver if you have some problems with your liver?
For most people, it would be like at least 3 tablespoons. It's not hard on the liver because the body will digest it. So it doesn't, in fact, a lack of oil may be hard on the liver, because what happens when you're taking some kind of fats, your body produces bile to digest them. And if you don't eat as much fats, you don't produce as much bile. So usually I recommend at least 2 or 3 tablespoons of fats for most people, sometimes a little bit more, but not much more, because then I think it may be hard to digest. It might interfere with digestion. The only person who could have more is someone who might be like an athlete, who's putting out tremendous amounts of energy, and usually their digestion is much stronger too.
And when you say 2 to 3, is that a day? Or?
It's a day. That's a day. Usually split over, or a tablespoon a meal or something like that. But the main fats I recommend is saturated and monounsaturated, because the polyunsaturated fats have a few problems. One is they lower the metabolism. So when you lower the metabolism, you put it into the stress mode. And the other thing they do is they can easily get damaged in the body and cause damage to the cells. So things like seed oils, like safflower, sunflower, hemp, and flax are ones that I don't recommend people use regularly or only in small amounts. The best ones would be coconut oil, which is actually disproven to cause any problems with the heart disease. Natural butter and also olive oil would tend to be the better ones to use regularly.
What about sesame seed?
Sesame seed has a lot of polyunsaturated fats, so I don't recommend people emphasize it. And the reason I think it came into teaching, because the original teachers of the 20th century introducing the idea of the modern macrobiotics came from Japan, and sesame oil was their main oil. So, because of, eating this way for many decades myself, then I like sesame oil, but I don't emphasize it because I know too much about the effects, the polyunsaturated fats.
And just one question related to that, whenever you say coconut oil, I think, we're so steeped in that, it's very yin, it's tropical, and, you shouldn't have it. So can you address that?
Sure. Well, that I didn't, even though people can grow some rice in the Northeast, most of the rice we are eating is from semi-tropical areas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a semi-tropical food. I don't think it's a good thing to have only rice. I think it's good to have a variety of grains. But it is a semi-tropical food, as is sesame. Sesame is coming from semi-tropical areas. It doesn't grow in the northeast places. So I think the coconut oil is an interesting food because even though it's tropical, it's not cooling to the body. Tropical food is cooling. So if you eat too much of that in a temperate zone, if you're in a hot place, you could eat them and should eat some of them. But if you're in a temperate zone, basically, it can be too cooling. But coconut oil doesn't have those properties. It's not excessively cooling. It actually speeds up the metabolism.
Right. Thanks so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? Or?
Right then.
Well, thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed.
Will you put your class in the chat, the class that you offer?
Sure, maybe.
Dave.
Hi, my name is Aviva. I have a question. Well, actually, two questions. I was wondering if you still shared this information while Misha was still alive. I don't know if he had an opinion on your discoveries, because I find a lot of contradictions with what Misha has been teaching a lot of us.
Sure.
So that's one question, and that wondering, you still use the name Macrobiotics, although I hear a lot of things that are very different from what Macrobiotics stands for. So I'm just curious why you still like to keep the name Macrobiotics, although it's you found a lot of things are not healthy or not. Yeah, I'm just curious what.
Sure. Well, that's a good question. The reason why I keep the word macrobiotics is because I don't think macrobiotics is owned by anybody. Michio Kushi didn't create macrobiotics, and George Osawa didn't create it. They just used the term. Supposedly, George Osawa got it from Hoofland, from the 16th century, 17th century in Europe, and the original word, or the derivative of the word, came from Hippocrates. Mm-hmm. So I use the word because I think that basically it's a broader understanding of macrobiotics. Macrobiotics means the way of longevity. That's how I interpret it from Hippocrates, and this is how it's been used throughout the centuries, the way of longevity. And so I think these are macrobiotic teachings because they're based on the philosophy of balance. And I think that one of the things that happens with pioneers is that a lot of times they won't evolve the teachings. They'll evolve the teachings somewhat, but only to a certain extent. And so I think we need to make changes when we see evidence. What I saw was evidence that people were getting hurt. So I saw evidence that I believe the nutritional deficiencies was directly related to people getting cancer young in their lives, of the teachers. And it happened to some students who were doing this long term. It happened to one person who healed themselves of cancer, and then 15 years later, they died of another cancer, eating a very narrow diet. And I saw a lot of health issues among students over the last 40 years who are doing this a long time. So I think the changes, I think we need to be open to making changes in things and not follow an authority, even a good authority. I mean, as you see, there's many things that are still the same that I feel that we should do, like eating whole grains and vegetables and beans. And I think an updated version built on the diagnosis is very beneficial, and energetics of food and lifestyle. It's just changes that I felt ethically that it was important to make.
Mm. So did Michaud ever hear of these changes, or this happened after his death, the discoveries that you made?
Well, it happened during that time, but my experience was that he wasn't open to changing his teachings.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't feel like he wanted to change anything.
Did he explain
what for years? No.
No.
No, just that I got the impression because it was correct, you know, so it was the way to do it.
Hmm.
Which,
because
you know, pioneers are like that, so.
Because I've had a actually opposite experience. I think the basis of macrobiotics is very correct. I think animal food I find very dangerous food, and we're seeing now with the coronavirus that animal food is really a big problem for our society for all different reasons, especially the emotional. I mean, the energetics of eating an animal. We all know, and we've all studied that people who eat animal food also start to behave a bit like animals. We get more aggressive. We get more, and these things I find very important as a society. I'm wondering if what we're not looking into is, like you're saying, we eat too narrow diets, or people who have had cancer, they get cancer again. I'm wondering if it's that we're not fully understanding what macrobiotics is besides the food, but also the emotional aspects, our constitution, etc. And to me, eating animal food is, I find that goes against our spiritual development, which is really the goal. It keeps us very much animal. And that's my concern, is that if we go to animal food, we stop a certain evolution that Michaud taught us, which Oshawa taught us, which even Hippocrates said that it's every detail of making the bread is so essential. If it's too wet, if it's too dry, if it's so every little thing does make a difference. So I'm just wondering about this aspect. If it's not.
Sure. Yes. Well, you'd have to think. Everybody has to make a decision for themselves what to do. You know, I'm not trying to convince. I'm just saying I'm open to working with people who are eating. You know, I can help people who want to be vegan, who want to be vegetarian. Although my personal experience is that nutritional deficiency is great on vegan diets unless you make balance for it. And I personally can't go with the idea that people who eat meat are not spiritual. I've known more spiritual people who eat meat than many of the people eating macrobiotically, vegan-wise. Over the years, I saw many unspiritual behaviors. Plus, also around the world, you have people all over the world who had very high spirituality, American Indians and others eating animal food, you know, natural animal foods. So I think it really depends on, I think a lot of the aggression and behavior is coming from more than diet, but diet that's very poor quality, you know, factory farm, excessive consumption of everything. But I think around the world, when you look at the people like even Weston Price, when you see the people he went around, he said he met the most ethical people that he ever saw, more ethical than anyone. He also tried to find vegetarian populations that were healthy, and he couldn't find them at that time in the 30s. So I think there's a different perspective, but I just leave it that we have to think about it, and I hope people have an open mind in thinking about this.
I
thank
see
you very
that
much.
Thank you.
Can I just make one comment, please?
Please.
Okay, I loved what Aviva had to say, and I really understand, and I relate to what she's saying, you know, and I love what John's saying too, you know, and I was just I was getting back into reading about Marxism, and it's really interesting because it says, in the controversy, the intellectual values of his ideas get lost. Knowledge advances by using and revising ideas to account for the facts we turn up, building on strengths, shoring up weaknesses. And I feel like that's what this has done for me with seeing how John has advanced it. And I first became interested in you, and it was my only encounter with you is through your book, Beyond Macrobiotics. It just kind of blew the lid off for me. So maybe that's one reason I'm more open and receptive to what you're saying, although I do definitely understand and relate to Aviva as well. But it's like you're saying, if people are open to eating meat, that would be a hard jump for me. But at the same time, you know, I want to be open to new ideas, and I also hear what you're saying, and it makes sense. I had the same questions that you had about people dying.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you, Aviva, too.
You're welcome.
And,
I would read Michio wrote about his cancer, and if somebody was mentioning that about Michio's cancer, and he writes in the cancer prevention book, he explains really well the whole story of his family's cancer. So I don't know who asked about it, but I would really read it because it was inspiring for me to understand it. But thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again, Gannat, Sheldon.
Thank you, John.
Pleasure.
Okay, we could finish up here, and thanks very much for everybody attending.